Hey guys, so last episode we discussed the Prime Directive, what it was, the general order, and all of its suborders. If you're watching this and it seems like I haven't addressed something, it's possible that I have, so please watch the previous episodes. You should be able to find it in the top right-hand corner, so be warned, if you bring up something about the suborders or something I don't seem to address, I'll probably refer you back to that video because I've probably addressed it. As we discussed previously, the Prime Directive, when used as a pragmatic law that was applied on a case-by-case basis, it makes a lot of sense. It's a way of keeping others out of our affairs and preventing us from getting involved in affairs that we don't have any business in. When looked at logically and basing it on our ethical grounds, there can be times to step in. But on the whole, it makes sense not to break it in general. Unlike a dogma, breaking the Prime Directive is grievous, but it's not a sin against God, and it's something that can be justified. Now let's discuss where the Prime Directive is treated as if it were the Holy Scriptures of God himself. I know that I get pretty wound up when we discuss this aspect of the Prime Directive, but it's because, honestly, not only do I find it to be profoundly stupid, I find it to be insulting to the intelligence of the audience and to humanists. This abomination of an interpretation can be generally found in Enterprise, The Next Generation, and Voyager. The premise at first glance in these shows appears to be quite easy to understand. Basically, we don't know what our interference would do to a species or a civilization, so let's stay out of it. As Phlox, in one of his most stupid moments, says when trying to justify allowing a painful disease to genocide an entire species, all I'm saying is to let nature decide. Phlox is saying this because he believes that nature knows best. Perhaps nature will pick and choose by plan who should live and who should die. Of course, nature would have the best interests of the ecosystem in mind, so we should allow it to continue. But you want to know a common name for a mystical force whose will we don't want to interfere in because maybe it knows best? Generally, people call that God. So let's address this further. Let's address the argument, we don't know what could happen and nature may know better than us argument. This argument is ultimately the argument from ignorance fallacy. Every action we do will have a consequence. Of that, we can be certain. However, how impactful that consequence is, we can only guess. We simply don't know. For some reason, it is common for humanity to assume consequences will always be negative. If we aren't sure what will happen, by definition, it means it could be either good or bad. That's the point. And if both of these outcomes are possible, then we can't always assume it will be negative. What we can do is weigh the good with the bad in a reasonable fashion. In fact, I would argue that generally every situation has a middle ground with both some good and some bad. It is not reasonable to assume that a baby might become Hitler, so we need to kill it. But it is reasonable to assume that a baby that isn't given medicine when sick may get worse and die, so giving medicine is logical. The most reasonable expectation is to make decisions based on what you have now and assume the moderates will happen, because they usually do. So a baby is unlikely to be Hitler. That's an extreme. You base it on what you have now. We have a baby, and a baby is more likely to be a normal person than a psychopath. So generally, we would let the baby live. This would be why we don't assist one faction in gaining nuclear technology in a war, but might stop a volcano from destroying an entire civilization. One is completely different from the other. We know giving nuclear weapons to a power during a world war will result in a lot of people dying. We don't know that a civilization about to be killed by a volcano will turn into space Nazis. Hell, they are just as likely to turn into a coalition of peace. Look at Earth. After World War III, factions began to cleanse the unclean that had radiation poisoning. Had the Vulcans saw this and destroyed Earth, we wouldn't have the Federation. You know, SF Debris, whose video I'll link below, really made the best argument, so I'm going to use it here. If there is some cosmic plan that nature has for the universe, we don't know it. And if we have the ability to act any way we want, then the only logical assumption is to act as if that plan doesn't exist. Because we won't know if we were meant to interfere or not. So we might as well act in what we think is the best option for the people involved. We involve ourselves at a small scale to intervene against nature all the time. In many states in the country I live, wildfires will occur naturally due to different reasons, whether it be lightning or something else. When these wildfires consume entire houses and threaten people, including children, we step in to stop it. We stop nature from killing other people. We have an entire medical industry dedicated to stopping nature itself. And the Federation is no different. But when it comes to another civilization, Suddenly, there are concerns about stepping in nature's way. I mean, seriously? I mean, hell, by that logic, and again, this is a point SF Debris makes, we find in nature all kinds of barbaric things. An Amazon ant will find other ants' nests, go to it, kill all the adults, enslave the children, making them think that they actually belong to her, make them become worker drones, use them to kill the adults of other ant colonies, and enslave those children. This is natural, but I doubt many would call it moral. So Phlox and Archer, and you'll forgive me for being crass and using some religious terminology here, can go to hell with this argument. It makes no sense. It's not logical, and since we can't know, we don't know if we should interfere or not, so we shouldn't act like a plan exists at all. I mean, seriously, and these are the pillars of Starfleet at this time, the 22nd century best of the best. Look, if you watch the other video, you know I am not saying that we should intervene willy-nilly. I honestly think that pragmatically every instance is a case-by-case analysis, and more often than not, we don't interfere. But when you turn it into this dogma that there might be a bigger plan and that we should let nature decide, you're worse than whatever plague or event is occurring. Blindly trusting anything is never a good idea. So the genesis of the Prime Directive in Enterprise makes no sense. To believe it as a dogma or principle falls apart when you apply basic logic to it. In the Next Generation, we see them take the dogma to the next level. And again, this is piggybacking off of SF Debris, but he's just so succinct when he puts it this way. I mean, I almost didn't make a video because of how well he did it. Let's look at Pen Pals. In Pen Pals, you get the gambit of how to interpret the Prime Directive. Worf thinks that you can't disobey it no matter what, full stop. Riker gives the Phlox argument of God being there. Pulaski thinks that we should help everything short of war, and Picard uses that to state how it gets murkier. How when you look at geological or disease, it makes more sense to help, but you shouldn't be able to help in war. And then he uses that to say we shouldn't help at all. But if I can just take a moment, I think they're all wrong. We shouldn't intervene just because of an X example. Just because a civilization is about to be wiped out by a geological event, as an example, doesn't mean we automatically help. It's a lot more likely that we will over a war, but it's not something in stone. That's just trading dogma for dogma. Again, it has to be more nuanced than that. Every situation should be carefully examined, carefully considered. But because in the Next Generation, the Prime Directive is not just law but dogma, tenets from high, it must be absolute to them. And if it must be absolute, then we can't help anybody, unless they send out an SOS apparently. Look, let's take a look at another episode, the drumhead. People have tried to use this as an example of how Picard and TNG does not treat the Prime Directive as a religion. Honestly, I think it's the prime example of how they do. Consider this. You have a woman who is out for blood. She is paranoid that everyone is her enemy. She is conducting a hearing to prove that Captain Picard is in the wrong. And what does she do? She talks about how, as a part of the Borg, he killed thousands upon thousands of people. And what else does she talk about? What else is on par with becoming a Borg and killing tens of thousands of people? How Picard has broken the Prime Directive so many times. Consider that. Being turned into an agent of the Borg is on par with breaking the Prime Directive. How this man who everyone thinks is great, has broken the Prime Directive. He's broken the tenets of the Federation. This man has fallen short of the glory of God. He has turned his back on paradise, and you don't turn your back on paradise. We should shut him off like some useless thing. And while it's inferred that Picard never got in trouble for what he did, the episode never points out that these things aren't on par with the Borg. That the Prime Directive probably doesn't hold as much weight as killing tens of thousands of people and almost destroying the Federation. Because to them, in this episode, it does. And really, I'm starting to ramble. I don't even know if this is making any sense, which is ironic because I've scripted it all. And just moving forward, do I even have to get into Voyager, guys? Janeway is constantly challenged on the Prime Directive, and when proved wrong, simply orders people to do what she says. And that's assuming she listens to him at all. My problem with the entirety of this approach is that it's bad religious fanfiction. Picard talks about how he doesn't believe in religion and how it's archaic. And then you see how he and everyone else treats the Prime Directive as if it were one. Rules from paradise. He has simply replaced one religion for another. It is insulting to the audience, it is insulting to atheists and or humanists, and it's even insulting to the religious. I'm going to leave you guys with the last few minutes of SF Debris' video. SF Debris is a huge inspiration. This channel wouldn't exist without me having watched a lot of his catalog, so go take a look at him. Don't forget to comment, rate, and subscribe, and guys, I'm going to see you on the next Lore Reloaded.
This is not to say that everything about the Prime Directive is bad. The flaw is really in its application, that it is applied even when it makes no sense or is morally repugnant. It would be far more reasonable if the Prime Directive were intended to be for starships so that they would have to get approval before violating it, to keep them from getting involved when they shouldn't be, but allowing them to get involved when they were needed. Instead, we have the current approach that's completely at odds with critical thinking. Sweeping arguments and mantras are almost always what we get, rather than specific reasons why it would be wrong here. Not imposing our values on a society may be a valid argument when discussing a confrontation between two groups, but when it's one group who's dying from some natural disaster, then how do values come into play? I mean, I suppose maybe they want to be annihilated by a volcano. We maybe should ask them first. This even leads to misplaced morality. I mean, it's understandable to say that you don't want to get involved because it'd be complicated or difficult or drawn out. But taking that to the point where it's being called the enlightened or moral option is covering it over for the sake of one's conscience or ego. Where else is it called enlightened and moral to do that which is simple over that which is complicated? What would require no effort over one that would require hard work? Fear taken to an extreme is an irrational fear. Being afraid for your child is good when it compels you to do good things for them, like buckling their seatbelt and dressing them for the weather. But taken to its irrational extreme, you become too afraid to let your child even leave the house. When fear leads to total inability to act regardless of what is rational or obvious, then that fear is a hindrance. The fear of becoming colonial or oppressive or evil, if any involvement is made under any circumstances, is no more rational than thinking if you rescue someone from drowning, you'll be responsible for putting them through college now, or that if you save a woman from being raped, you now have to marry her. There remains a middle ground between we must stick our nose in everything and we must stand by and allow global extinctions. To do so requires the exact opposite of dogmatism. It requires thinking, carefully weighing one's options, and then doing what is for the best given the facts you have at hand. In other words, the same approach taken to every other problem you're handed. Reasoning doesn't suddenly break down just because the stakes have been raised. That's the time when reason is all the more vital. And to be honest with oneself. An individual whose only response to the pleas of multitudes dying is pointing at a piece of paper is not the hero in your story.